On behalf of my co-authors and myself, I'll be presenting the paper on the history, the present, and the possible future of the Waqf institution. My co-authors on this paper are Dr. Khalil Abdul Rashid from Harvard University, Dr. Altaf Hussain from Howard University, and my current affiliation being with Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. My previous affiliations in education and research are Al-Madina School in Brooklyn, City University of New York, Respect Graduate School, Lehigh University, and Lamppost Education Initiative. So this paper is a genealogy of the Waqf institution, because to understand the Waqf is to understand Islamic philanthropy. And throughout the paper, I use the correct Arabic plural of Waqf, which is awqaf, and the English version, which is waqfs, with an S at the end, which is a decision that was made during the paper for the ease and the readability of our English-speaking audience. So I'll go back and forth between awqaf and waqfs. So on behalf of my co-authors and myself, we'll be presenting this genealogy of the past, present, and future of the institution of Muslim charitable endowments. The big questions that we try to answer in this paper are: what can we learn from the history of the formation, the maturation, the transformation, and the ultimate deterioration of waqfs? And how can this inform the state of Muslim charitable giving today? And why this is important is because as a community that is extremely charitable, mashallah, we can brainstorm ways that awqaf can be revitalized as the normative institution for financing kindness in society, and that this can be done in a way that can address and solve some of the structural causes of poverty in our world today, inshallah. So I begin the history of the awqaf with Islam's spiritual obligation to charitable giving. And this is the ontological ground of the awqaf. Parting with one's wealth fulfills the religious obligation of zakat, but at the same time, it resounds at the deeper soulific level of salvation by enabling the purification of the heart and the beautification of one's character. Kind words, helping someone across the road, removing litter from the street, showing affection to one's spouse or one's children, feeding the poor, and even remembering God are among the numerous actions that are considered charitable in Islam. According to God's promise, the interchange of material blessings increases the flow of spiritual blessings. Now, waqf is not a word that we find in the Quran, but the coining of the term by the scholars in the 3rd Islamic century to mean charitable endowment is rooted on the actions of the earliest Muslims, the very first companions and community, acting on a particular verse in the Quran. Allah says in verse 92 of Surah Al-Imran, "None of you will attain true piety unless you give out of what you cherish. Whatever you give, God knows about it very well." The companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam took this very seriously. Now, this is an academic conference, but as an academic, Islam provides the first principles of research and inquiry. The fact that the companions are the first interlocutors in mapping the genealogy of the Waqf is essential, not incidental to the meaning of the institution. As Muslims, we know that our adoration for the historical companions is not a romanticized idealism of a golden past, nor is it a refusal to grapple with the present. But the companions are the first link in a living chain of tradition and embodied knowledge that connects Muslims in all communities across time and space to the revelation as it was revealed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The strength of the companions' faith was due to their proximity and companionship to him, to the fact that they grew in his splendid light and took comfort in his shade. So their example provides subsequent generations of Muslims, including ourselves, with practical blueprints to pious action and self-purification. And as an academic, and college students and graduate students should do this in their research papers as well, we affirm that the Prophet was not a genius, but a divinely chosen messenger of Allah, and that faith is not only a psychological state, but it's a form of true knowledge. All research has its first principles, even its given assumptions. In liberal academia, these givens are all materialist or of naturalist philosophy, but Muslim researchers would necessarily posit the first principle of La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. So the companions took this verse literally, and after consultation and guidance from the Prophet, established practices that later scholars would identify as waqf endowment. During the formative period of waqfs, which lasted from the Prophet's time in Medina through the early Abbasid period, the essence and contours of Muslim philanthropy took shape. When Abu Talha, one of the Prophet's companions, heard this verse, he donated his date grove with over 600 date palms in the service of Medina's poor, to which his wife assented and for which she thanked him. This is considered the first waqf in Islam. The parameters of waqfs, also called ahbas by Imam Malik, were laid out in the practice of the Prophet's advice given to several companions and their children. A waqf charitable endowment involves that the bequeather or subsequent maintainer sequester the principal and devote the proceed to charity, that the endowment be specifically and legally removed from commodification, and that its sole purpose be charitable. During Imam Shafi and At-Tabari's time, that is, the 2nd and 3rd Islamic centuries, the waqfs were called sadaqat in the scholarly literature, and there are records of dirhams and date trees being converted to endowments. The post-formative period comprises the 3rd through 7th Islamic centuries, from the early Abbasid period through the start of Mamluk rule in Egypt. During this time, the waqf became codified in Islamic law across schools. Waqfs comprised mosques and madrasa colleges. During this period, the Muslim world experienced tremendous urban and rural development on account of waqfs. Beginning initially with the patronage of learning, Islamic arts and sciences began to flourish on account of Islamic philanthropy as well as royal patronage. Science, literature, philosophy, architecture, glass and crystal making, painting and pottery, writing and calligraphy, textiles and technology, all were among the earliest Islamic philanthropic ventures. Research and invention became extensions of ritual worship. That was the case in urban areas. In rural areas, Waqf took the form of agricultural materials such as farming tools, work animals, and agricultural real estate. The maturation period of waqfs, from the start of Mamluk rule through the first half of Ottoman rule, which is the 7th through 11th Islamic centuries, saw a tremendous diversification. As the community's needs changed, so did the services provided by the waqfs. Waqfs now helped to dispense of social services in the wake of Mongol invasions and the Crusades, and responded in various ways to famine, an increase in women entrepreneurs and female scholars, increased human migration and travel, and the significant growth of international commerce. New forms of waqf in the maturation period include Sufi lodges, travelers' inns, soup kitchens, public baths, famine relief centers, the construction and maintenance of the tombs of scholars, hospitals, veterinary services, animal fountains, prayer rooms along travel routes, libraries, public water fountains, orphanages, public bathhouses, cemeteries, kindergarten and primary schools, institutions devoted to charitable causes like freeing the slaves, feeding the poor, paying debts, and distributing gifts on the 2 Eids, and the burial and preparation of the deceased. The rabats, or single women devotional lodges, which first emerged in the 6th Islamic century, further developed during this period. Here, elite women, alongside poor women, divorcees, and widows, would share quarters and pay rent, quote unquote, through strict devotional services. These spaces cultivated female piety while also solving the problem of female homelessness. Some rabats were also established to double as hospice centers for women, where divorced and elderly women would receive end-of-life care by the devotees. In the 8th Islamic century, there were 20 documented rabats in and around Damascus, as well as several in Cairo. During this period, the Ottoman Empire is known to have pioneered the Waqf society. There were a total of 26,300 awqaf that were officially recorded as having existed in the empire, and 1,400 of these were established by Ottoman Muslim women. It was also during this period that the requisite elements of awqaf were further refined. Scholars stipulated that the Waqf establishment required 4 elements. 1, an official written document of declaration. 2, the endowment must be designated along with the sequestering of a portion so that the proceeds go to charity. 3, the beneficiary group must be named. And 4, the benefactor must be named. Once established in this way, the Waqf could not be revoked, sold, gifted, or inherited. The transformation period of awqaf from the 10th through 13th Islamic centuries witnessed an increase in the number of Jewish and Christian waqfs. The other major transformation in this time was the introduction of the cash waqf. Now, up until this time, urban waqfs mostly consisted of residential and commercial buildings whose rent went to charitable purposes, and rural waqfs mostly consisted of farms, fields, and agricultural equipment so that the harvested fruits and vegetables would either be distributed directly or sold for cash that would benefit the needy. With the advent of cash waqfs in the Ottoman Empire, proceeds earned from an investment were used in interest-based banking and lending. Although not considered legal by the scholars in Islamic law in the period, the famous Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam for 30 years, Abu Su'ud Effendi, legitimized the practice of cash waqfs in the legal epistle he wrote in 1545. In it, he stipulated that cash waqfs were valid and permissible with two conditions. One, by ensuring through certain Islamic legal devices that the contract took on the formal requirements of a sale, and two, that the interest not exceed 15%. Not endorsing that, it's just a historical fact. The deterioration period of waqfs was during the 13th and 14th Islamic centuries, lasting until World War I. And of course, it's worth mentioning that the deterioration period of the awqaf come right at the heels of when interest-based lending became normalized. Due to the direct involvement of colonial powers, waqfs in the Muslim world declined significantly. European colonizer states generally failed to comprehend the waqf system and through economic restructuring disrupted the practice of endowments beyond recognition. For example, in Zanzibar, awqaf traditionally helped to foster bonds of interdependence between wealthy patron families and their less well-to-do clientele. The British, imposing their modern economic norms, structures, and processes, insisted that wealth instead function as a private business resource, while mosques be kept up by the government. The former Waqf clientele became a working class entirely dependent on wage labor. In their mission to codify and fix interpretations, colonial administrators often undermined traditional female trusteeship in favor of exclusively male trusteeship, what we call the mutawalli of the Waqf. While colonial outposts farther removed from the metropoles, like Tanganyika, which later became Tanzania, while these further removed places saw relative longevity for awqaf and female trusteeship, the centers of colonial rule experienced an interrupted and uprooted history of the traditional institution. The other cause of deterioration of waqfs the other reason why the waqfs deteriorated was because they became nationalized, and over time they were bankrupted and without any operational funding. The post-colonial Muslim governments were not able to meet the social service needs that were previously handled by the waqfs, leading to increasing impoverishment and general neglect. To give the Ottoman example, at the close of the 18th century in the Common Era, the estimated combined income of about 20,000 awqaf equaled 1/3 of the Ottoman state's total revenue. And this is a sprawling amount, both geographically when you think of how enormous the territory of the Ottoman Empire was, but also fiscally when you think of what the revenue of this empire was. When we look at the numbers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Algeria, Tunisia, and Greece, we see that significant percentages, over the majority, of all arable land, cultivated soil, or total land area were due to awqaf. Shifting gears into the present, we find that globally, Muslims annually give in charity between $250 billion and $1 trillion. In North America, that mostly takes the form of relief efforts and remittances sent back home. After September 11, 2001, Muslim giving in the United States has seen a shift to more domestic causes, and this is, of course, partly due to the fact that our assets and our financial giving and taking were scrutinized in the so-called war on terror. We have also seen the opening up of new nonprofit spaces during this time, such as the Pillars Fund and the American Muslim Fund. What has not yet emerged is an effort to centralize the giving at the national level in a similar way to the United Way, Salvation Army, Catholic Charities, or the Jewish Federation. And I suppose that we would need our shuyukh and our sheikhas to brainstorm with our sociologists and historians of the American context to see if indeed that is a desirable goal, to centralize giving or not. The 2019 Philanthropy report, published by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding and the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, provides more details about why and where American Muslims give. So nearly 89% of respondents reported that they contribute to their house of worship, 54% find overseas relief an important cause for the community, and this is consistent with all the other faith groups who responded in this study. 52% of Jews and Catholics, 48% of Protestants, and 60% of white evangelicals said the same. One social location where Muslims spend more than any other faith group is civil rights protection for the members of their community, and that number is at 48%. Domestic poverty is the most important charitable cause outside the community, followed by overseas relief and educational causes. And that brings me to the concluding part of the paper. This research looks at the past, present, and potential future of Waqf. Looking ahead to that possible future, I ask, how can the Waqf be revitalized today in a way that is relevant to our society's structural poverty and authentic to the ethical impetus for Islamic giving? I provide two concrete examples of pressing need and propose that these can be sites for establishing modern-day Waqf. So the two examples. Globally, at the beginning of the 21st century, half of the human population, which is 3 billion people, live in poverty on less than $2 a day, $2 American dollars a day. 2 billion around the world suffer mineral deficiency, 1 billion have no access to potable water, and 840 million are undernourished and hungry. Poverty and food insecurity seasonally lead to incidents like drought, war, inclement weather, and famine. Ironically enough, 3/4 of the world's undernourished people live in rural areas, and they are the producers of the food that we all eat. In our own nation, poverty refracts along racial lines. White households average wealth in the amount of $656,000, Latino households average $98,000, and Black households average $85,000. Average Black and Latino households don't even combine to equal half of average white wealth. Compounding this stark reality, it would take the average Black family 228 years to accrue the same amount of wealth that white families have today through inherited advantage. But what are the root causes of poverty today, as in the two examples that I've given? This question can be approached in at least three ways. 1, spiritual impoverishment, 2, structural exploitation, and 3, cultural norms. Focusing on the relation between spiritual impoverishment and structural exploitation, I propose that permaculture design can address the crisis of the global plight of farm workers. Permaculture design, theorized by Bill Mollison, is the conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. It's the harmonious integration of landscape and people, providing their food, energy, shelter, and other material and non-material needs in a sustainable way. One of the assumptions behind permaculture design is that local ecosystems are capable of providing for the needs of the things that live in them. But that's not how the current agricultural design in the world works. The process from farm to table goes something like this. Wilderness is grazed to the ground. Most arable land is converted to subsistence agricultural farms, which specialize in only specific species of a small number of crops or animals. These species are selected based on their resistance to diseases and toxic pesticides. Post-colonial states in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa were assigned their crops based on the Europeans' vision of a single global supply chain, what are called cash crop economies, or what in Latin America is called the banana republics. Countries that survive off cash crop economies are extremely vulnerable to devastation and even starvation, as they are susceptible to changes in global supply and demand, as well as bad harvest seasons. The species that are exclusively selected, for example of tomatoes or of cows, become extremely immune deficient over time, as there is no more of the crossbreeding that we find in nature that keeps genetic pools robust. They are also vulnerable to plague, which would wipe out the supply of millions, and for this reason, farmers over-medicate the creatures, all of which gets into our own bodies, as well as gets into our babies through breast milk. Internationally, the farm workers, as I mentioned, get paid pennies per hour of labor producing the world's food supply. American farms don't do much better than their international counterparts, and they're disappearing one by one. The current global agribusiness arrangement is directly forcing vast majorities of the world's agricultural population into extreme poverty and hunger, often to the brink of death. The racist politics of agrobusiness also lead to food deserts and urban centers in which fresh and healthy produce becomes utterly unavailable. This dismal trajectory follows the logic of capitalist accumulation and the monopolization that governs international trade. Transportation costs are more and more lowered thanks to war against oil-rich countries, followed by what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. And agricultural trade is liberalized, meaning that it's forcibly opened up into more global, quote-unquote, free markets. In reality, so-called free trade involves one set of exchangers enjoying full protection by the state's military power and the market's regulatory mechanisms, and the other set of exchangers has no security and has no say in the terms of trade whatsoever. International Monetary Fund or IMF relations, for example, don't involve contracts among equals, but they are slave contracts. Those of you without a background in political economy who've seen Stephanie Black's documentary Life in Debt will recognize some of what I'm describing. We think always that new and improved technology and the globalization of the world is essentially and necessarily a good thing always, but on the ground these devices benefit the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Motorization and mechanization of farm equipment are too costly and can never be universally accomplished. They also produce widespread unemployment, destroying people's ability to sustain themselves and their families, communities, and nations. The under-equipped peasantry has to, quote-unquote, compete with overseas commodities like bananas, lettuce, carrots, meat, or milk that come from those small 10% of fully revolutionized, fully motorized and mechanized successful factory farms that can afford to offer their produce at extremely low prices. And so the farms and their workers fall one by one. So remember earlier I said that during the maturation period of Waqfs in Islamic history, as the community's needs changed, so did the services provided by the Waqf. Today, our needs are deeply entangled in the global economic system, which is a life-sucking force, what Tom Hartman calls cannibalism, from the Algonquian term wetiko, meaning a sickness of complete lack of concern for others, in his article on Columbus Day. Given our reality, the question becomes, how can Islam inspire Muslims to challenge and block the ravages of global capitalism? And in the context of the present paper, how can we revive Waqf to redress these deadly ravages? By the way, this is only the author's views, does not represent Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research necessarily. Okay. Investing in permaculture design would produce several concrete solutions to the crisis of global agriculture. It would localize food production, localize farm labor, wrestle control over the food supply away from big business, and invest communities with greater responsibility for how we live and what we eat. It would rewild tracts of agricultural land, meaning to give land back to the wilderness, to let the wilderness grow back. To increase biodiversity and soil resilience. I don't know if you know this, but the soil is very depleted of any nutrients that can go into the foods and benefit our bodies because of how it's used. And interrupt the global supply chain that thrives on the pauperization of most of the world's farm workers. The other example that I proposed as a space for revitalizing Waqf today is the racial wealth divide in America. Over the past 3 decades, racial wealth discrepancies have only grown. After adjusting for inflation, we find that between 1983 and 2016, median wealth of white families has increased from 110,000 to 147,000. Median wealth of black families has decreased by half, from 7,000 to 3,500. And median wealth of Latino families has increased slightly from 4,000 to 6,500, which still represents only 4% of median white wealth. Alhamdulillah, we have scores of charities that provide millions in assistance. May Allah bless them and accept it from them. And we have a wonderful, anti-racism organizations like Muslim Arc that do research, curriculum, and community partnerships. What we can do through the vehicle of the Waqf to specifically target the racial wealth gap in the United States is finance think tanks, media outlets, and advocacy institutions specific to this issue. In addition, Muslims can find concrete recommendations for creating target-specific Waqf endowments in the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, Ohio State University, Institute for Policy Studies, and Inequality.org 2019 joint report called 10 Solutions to Bridge the Racial Wealth Divide. The report makes policy recommendations at the federal level, but several of these can be blueprints for private Waqf programs. For example, we can create baby bonds, which are managed accounts set up at birth for children, endowed at a level based on the financial position of that child's family. Each year thereafter, money is added to that account, again inversely proportionate to the poverty level of their family. When the child reaches adulthood, the bond can be used toward education, purchasing a home, or opening a business. The hope is to begin to redress the ravages of unfair race-based inherited advantage that systematically underdevelops opportunities for the majority of Black and Latino families. Recent research at Columbia University's Center on Poverty and Social Policy has shown that, properly instated, baby bonds could reduce the racial wealth divide by more than tenfold. Guaranteed employment is another potential Waqf site. Research shows that simply increasing workforce participation is not enough for allowing families to lift themselves above poverty. Most working class families, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls the working poor, work several jobs simultaneously all their lives and still pass zero wealth or poverty onto their children. More good jobs that pay living wages are needed for all those who are able to work. Guaranteed employment would take a certain form at the federal level, but privately at the Waqf level, Muslims can create job banks in their local areas in which they come up with a register of all of the necessary tasks, and they prioritize employing low-income adult workers at minimum wage, which is an annual $24,600 for full-time work, and it would also include a benefits package, a standard one. After adjusting for inflation, minimum wage has not only failed to keep up, it has actually gone down since 1968. It is impossible to survive on today's minimum wage. Building toward guaranteed employment would begin to redress this. Another potential Waqf site is investment in affordable housing. There is not a single state in the United States today where a worker who earns the federal minimum wage, which is, who knows the federal minimum wage? $7.25 an hour. So there's not a single one of the 50 United States where someone who earns minimum wage can rent a 2-bedroom apartment, right? Muslims can endow trusts, like the Housing Trust Fund proposed by Senator Elizabeth Warren. The trust would provide homes for low-income families, and imagine the homes that Allah would prepare for us in Jannah if we helped with that, and also provide down payment assistance to first-time home buyers. The trust can specifically assist families at risk of losing their homes due to gentrification. It would also be a site to lobby legislators for shifting the present tax incentives, which privilege wealthy homeowners over renters and first-time buyers. Another potential Waqf site for redressing the racial wealth gap is something that I heard Sheikh Hamza Yusuf say at a conference 10 or 20 years ago. And since then, alhamdulillah, I've met a lot of Muslims who actually do this with their time, which is free medical clinics. So our community, mashallah, has a overflow of medical doctors, right? An abundance, mashallah. And so if we were to endow the building and the staffing of clinics in low-income areas, and if each of our doctors gave 1 day a week or 1 day a month, to give free medical checkups and treatments, it would have a huge positive impact on the overall health and well-being of those communities. Scores of Americans go into poverty every year just because of medical bills. Other potential and easy-to-implement Waqf programs include interest-free lending and fee-less check cashing, which would help to turn, right side up, the upside down and unequal race-based distribution of inherited advantage in the United States. Ustad Ubaidullah Evans recently at the Symposium on Muslim Philanthropy at Indiana University gave a really beautiful description and elaboration of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which he said that the hand above is better than the hand below. I think Sheikh Omar mentioned it this morning, meaning the hand that gives is better than the hand that receives. And he mentioned that African American Muslim communities and allied communities ought to sit in collaborative sessions together and brainstorm and map out mechanisms by which certain African American Muslim communities can become in a position to be the hands that give, and so that they can partake in the dignity of that blessing. It always strikes me in our ethnically and racially diverse Muslim community here in the United States that we are missing that beautiful and necessary Ansar Muhajirun relationship set up by the Prophet ﷺ when he saw his community in Medina divided in their ability, in their stability and in their resource base, in their ability to do for self. Their dignity was his concern. What would happen to the racial wealth divide in America if each migrant family was adopted by an indigenous family among African American, Latino American, or Native American communities, and vice versa, with an added layer of mutual rights and concern? Waqf are not limited to benefiting only Muslims, and so it stands to reason that such potential Waqf sites for redressing the racial wealth divide would help advance non-Muslim people in poverty in the United States as well. The possibilities are really endless if we create Waqf charitable endowments with the specific problems of our day in mind. That is, after all, the legacy of the Waqf. So that concludes our paper on the past, present, and potential future of financing kindness in society through Waqf charitable endowments. On behalf of my co-authors and myself, please forgive me if I misspoke, and if there was any good in it, may Allah accept it and may it become a seed of good in our community, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Wassalamu alaikum.